Good morning. The Subcommittee on Telecommunications and Technology will now come to order, and the chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The evolution in communications technology continues to change the lives of Americans, and for the better. The transition to the Internet Protocol technology underlying next-generation 911 service from the circuit-based networks of yesterday is a compelling example of this. Traditional 911 services permitted a voice call through the local phone company switch to be transferred directly to a public safety answering point, or a PSAP. Next-Gen 911 takes advantage of the robust capabilities of today's and tomorrow's digital networks and will allow the life-saving call to take the form of voice, text, or video from any wired, wireless, or IP-based device routed over a broadband network. Realizing next-generation 911 services throughout the nation is critical, but as with any large-scale transition, there are challenges to overcome. Issues regarding such matters as funding, governance, ensuring the security of the network are a few, and the cost will be significant. Yet, while funding is a challenge, studies reveal a troubling pattern whereby some states divert money collected from consumers intended for 911 services that could assist with the transition. The FCC reports that approximately $220 million, or 8.4%, of the total amount of fees collected by the states to fund 911 were diverted for non-911 purposes. This was in 2015 alone. Every member of this committee should agree to work aggressively on this issue. Our witness from the state of Indiana, Mr. Bitter, tells us in his testimony that a state's approach to governance is an important component of a successful transition. The majority memorandum notes that approximately half of the states have established 911 boards or similar entities. I look forward to a better understanding of how this coordinated command may facilitate transition. And we're all aware of the IP-based networks will be vulnerable to cyber attack. The FCC has said that additional work must be done to protect these networks, including encrypting data to ensure the integrity of traffic. What more can be done, and what is the best approach? With that said, we should recognize that this transition is underway, and these challenges are not insurmountable. According to an FCC report, 12 states report that NG911 is operational in 100% of the state. My home state of Tennessee is among those 12, a solid start for our nation, but well short of where we ought to be. We have taken steps to facilitate the transition. Most recently, in 2012, this committee, under Chairman Walden's leadership, was instrumental in passage of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, which not only created FirstNet to bring state-of-the-art communication capabilities to our nation's first responders, but also sought to further the NG911 transition. Republicans and Democrats must agree that having a modern 911 emergency response system is a national necessity. I look forward to our conversation today, and I yield the remaining time to Ms. Brooks for an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome a Hoosier to Washington, Barry Ritter, the Executive Director of Indiana 911. Along with Mr. Ritter, Kelly Mitchell, the Indiana State Treasurer, also in attendance, and Treasurer Mitchell chairs the State 911 Board and is actually the only treasurer in the country in this role. And so welcome, Ms. Mitchell. Mr. Ritter originally joined the state as the director of the Wireless 911 Advisory Board in 2010. He was an active participant in the 2012 session of the legislature, which brought about fundamental changes in the funding model in Indiana and operational responsibilities for 911 in Indiana, most notably the creation of the statewide 911 board. Prior to joining the board, he served for 4 years as the director of the Wayne County Consolidated Communications Center in Richmond, Indiana. He came into the world of 911 after serving more than 20 years as a police officer for the city of Richmond. And during his career, he held several assignments in the agency, eventually serving as deputy chief of police. Mr. Ritter earned his degree from Vincennes University and received his emergency number professional designation through the Nina Institute in 2009. We welcome your testimony today, Mr. Ritter, and appreciate you being here to provide this panel and to provide the other members here with your background and expertise. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Doyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening.
Well, thank you to the witnesses for being here today, and thank you, Madam Chair, for calling this hearing. The state and future of 911 systems in this country is a critical issue. As we move forward with the deployment of a national public safety broadband network for first responders, we need to recognize the importance of 911 service and the need for modernization for both the people that take 911 calls and those that are sent to respond to them. While Congress has allocated billions in funding and spectrum to leverage the construction and deployment of FirstNet, we have only allocated $115 million for NextGen 911. And while states and localities have an important role to play, we need to ensure that they have a strong partner in the federal government that is able to direct funding, expertise, and scale at this challenge. I'm disappointed that we're sitting here today without a clear idea of how much upgrading our nation's 911 infrastructure will cost, or what the ongoing costs will be of sustaining world-class 911 infrastructure throughout the country. I think what's clear is that the current funding mechanisms are not sufficient to meet current needs or to fund the next generation of upgrades. I would call on the majority to work with us to advance legislation to address these issues. And while I commend the work being done by the witnesses here to attack the problem, we need national solutions because citizens will not adopt these new technologies if they are not uniformly deployed and uniformly functional on a national basis. We are far past the time when localities should have a patchwork of solutions where some accept text messages, pictures, and videos, and others are still working with technology from the 70s. Smartphones and smart devices are the present and the future of emergency communications. As the testimony shows, the future of NextGen 911 are vehicle collision notifications being sent to 911 call centers and companies like Nest and other smart home safety and security products, which are already warning consumers about incidents in their homes. We need to be sure that both consumer, commercial, and municipal IoT infrastructure can communicate effectively with first responders. Recently, there have been a number of 911 outages in our country. This month, roughly 46 million AT&T customers lost access to 911 service for 5 hours. Approximately 12,600 people tried to dial 911 and weren't able to get through. More than AT&T's outage in a Dallas call center was overwhelmed by abandoned 911 calls, and we have reports of similar cases throughout the country. Some of these instances seem due to understaffing, while others, the root causes are still not clear. What is clear is that we are still facing challenges in places meeting basic service standards. I'd just add that compromised smartphones have already been used to attack the nation's 911 system. As the witnesses point out, moving the 911 system to an IP-based system opens up call centers to great cybersecurity challenges also. Deploying NextGen 911 services isn't just about expanding the ways people access emergency services. It's also about making sure these services are more redundant, more reliable, and more useful. I hope this hearing is educational to our members. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the witnesses, and I'd be happy to yield the remainder of my time to any member of the subcommittee that wants to use it. Seeing none, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you very much, and I thank you for holding this very important hearing and as we move forward on our work in this area. This morning we convened to examine the progress in the deployment of Next Generation 911. As a matter of coincidence, the timing could not have been better. Yesterday, FirstNet announced that it took the next step in its competitive bidding process It's expected FirstNet will soon execute a contract to form a public-private partnership in order to deploy a single nationwide wireless broadband network for our first responders. Nearly 13 years after the 9/11 Commission report highlighted grave deficiencies in the first responder communications, the most up-to-date communications capabilities will finally be at the fingertips of our brave men and women who protect us daily. Today, we all carry devices in our pockets. They allow us to communicate by voice, by text, by email, by video, and now that we are at the threshold of deployment of FirstNet, our nation's first responders will have a dedicated network to do the same. This is really important work. But our 9/11 networks, which are based on the technologies of the past, do not provide the seamless connection between the two. Only by bringing IP-based technology to the nation's public safety answering points, the professionals that are the first voice you hear when you call for help, can we bring the full promise of modern technology to serve us in times of emergency. In 2012, when we passed the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, which created FirstNet, we also took steps to facilitate the deployment of Next Generation 911. We engaged the 9/11 Implementation Coordination Office to work with the state and local authorities, asked for a report on the cost of NG 911, and established a matching grant program. We did all that as the work of this committee. Unfortunately, for reasons that were never made clear in response to our bipartisan inquiries, the prior administration did not get that funding out the door, nor did they produce the report. They failed on both counts. Today, I hope we can get a measure of how far the transition to NG 911 has come and some ideas about how to accelerate it. We understand there will be costs involved in the efforts of this magnitude. This is big stuff. I realize that. We've done a lot of oversight hearings over FirstNet and all of this along the way. But FirstNet and its participating states have shown there are smart ways to approach such complex public safety undertakings. Some states report they're already Next Generation 911 capable, and many others are pursuing the transition. So these states should be applauded for their efforts. However, while nearly every state collects money from their citizens for 911, some states have taken monies collected for 911 and then used it for other unrelated purposes. This cannot continue, period. Aside from the fact that this erodes the public trust, it ultimately impairs the transition to NG 911 for the nation as a whole. I look forward to hearing your testimony today. My thanks to all of you for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us, and I hope we will leave with a better understanding of what works and how we can use these lessons to move forward in a manner that best delivers Next Generation 911 services to our nations and our communities. And I apologize in advance. I've got two subcommittees meeting simultaneously and be bouncing between the two. Your testimony was terrific. We look forward to working with you. And I don't see Mr. Flores. I know he may be on his way, but he wanted to introduce one of our witnesses, Madam Chair. But in absence of that, if anybody wants the remainder of my time, I'm happy to yield it.
Does anyone seek the time?
Seeing none, I yield back to the chair.
And we know that Mr. Flores wanted to introduce this good Texas Aggie we have before us, but we're going to welcome him anyway. Ms. Matsui, you are recognized on Mr. Pallone's 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for holding this hearing today. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimonies. This morning's hearing highlights the challenges facing our 9/11 system. Not only are we underfunding our current 9/11 infrastructure, we're also failing to make investments to make Next Generation 911 a reality. As consumers, all of us have seen the incredible advances in technology. In just the last decade, we use our smartphone to do so much more than make phone calls. These devices can take pictures, send text messages, and record video. These tools could give first responders critical information. But today, very few 911 call centers can receive them. It is critical that we accelerate the deployment of the Next Generation 911 because it could improve access to emergency services for so many Americans, like people with disabilities and victims of domestic violence. We need to work together because this technology could truly save lives. And this time, I'd like to yield time to my colleague from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you. I thank my friend from California for yielding to me. Earlier this month, millions of wireless customers had to deal with a cascading nationwide failure of 9/11 service from my district in New York all the way to Washington and California. I look forward to the results of the FCC's investigation into this incident, but it speaks to a much larger problem. Our 9/11 infrastructure is outdated, bordering on obsolete. For some time now, we've had the technology to do a much better job of pinpointing the location of callers, even within buildings. 9/11 call centers could take text and other media and secure ESI nets, could share information and even calls across 911 systems. But we haven't made these leaps in part because there's been no commitment and in part because there's been no funding. So this fits into an even broader story about aging infrastructure across the board. From roads and bridges to the energy grid to our national cyber defense, we need to make major investments in any number of different areas. Tax cuts and credits alone aren't going to cut it. We need to make serious investments. I know that a lot of our witnesses here today will be more or less unanimous on the question of whether we should be taking these steps on next-gen 911, and I hope this subcommittee can come to some agreement about a smart way to move forward with some of these much-needed advances. But it's important to remember through all this that E911, the main federal grant program that supports 911 services across the country, is a joint program of the Department of Commerce, specifically NTIA, and the Department of Transportation, specifically NHTSA. And the White House's budget proposal would slash these two departments by 16% and 13% respectively. Massive cuts at a time when we need to be making smart investments. To me, those two things aren't smart and don't go together. So I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and their commitment to helping keep Americans safe. I hope that this hearing today can continue the conversation that we need to have about investing in our infrastructure. And I hope that this subcommittee can take the lead on moving our infrastructure into the 21st century. I believe that support of our infrastructure should be, can be, and will be a bipartisan move, and I hope we can do that. Thank you. I yield back unless Ms. Matsui wants her time back or anybody else.
Anyone else want to have time? I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back, and that concludes our opening statements. I remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, all member statements will be made a part of the opening statements record. With that, we want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for taking your time to testify before the committee. I also want to thank you for submitting your testimony well prepared. Today's hearing will consist of two panels. Each panel of witnesses will have the opportunity to deliver statements and to answer questions. So we will begin by welcoming Mr. Trey Forgety, who, by the way, has Tennessee ties. We like that. And Mr. Magnuson, I would suggest that being a Texan, you get to know the young man. Wouldn't be a Texas without Tennessee. So glad you all are seated next to each other. Or Kentucky either. That's exactly right. You know, we volunteer to do, somebody's giving me the hook 'em horns back there, so put your hand down, I saw it. Mr. Forgety is the Director of Governmental Affairs and Regulatory Counsel at National Emergency Number Association. Mr. Walt Magnuson serves as the Director of Internet to Technology Evaluation Center at Texas A&M University. Ms. Mary Boyd, who is the VP of Regulatory Policy and External Affairs at West Safety Services. Ms. Boyd is testifying on behalf of the Industry Council for Emergency Technologies. Mr. Barry Ritter, who was so ably introduced by Congresswoman Brooks, and she is leading our effort, Mr. Ritter, as we look at NG 911. She is leading that effort on behalf of our subcommittee and the committee at large, and we thank her for that. And we thank you for doing such a great job helping her to understand and to grow and to know all about this issue. Mr. Steve Souter, who is representing the Maryland Emergency Number 911 Systems Board. He was previously the former director at Fairfax County 911. We appreciate all of you being here. We will begin the panel with you, Mr. Fogarty. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Doyle for hosting this hearing. It's a great pleasure for me to appear before you and an honor to appear beside such an august panel here. I mean, you really have all of the heavy hitters from the 911 industry sitting next to me here, so it's great to appear with them. The reason we're here ultimately is the way that we communicate in the United States has changed radically over the last 30 years. We're now a nation that has more wireless connections, more devices, more gadgets, more things that can connect to a network than we have people. And all of those devices are being used by consumers in ways that we could not have imagined only a few short decades ago. Already, text and video communications, things like FaceTime and WhatsApp and Facebook, are overtaking voice. People don't communicate with a telephone call anymore. For people in my generation and younger, that's not our first instinct. When we want to reach out and touch somebody, we're more likely to make a video call or send a text. But 911 has not changed at the same time. Today's 911 systems are still using technology that was invented in the 60s and 70s and deployed in the 80s and 90s. These systems make it very difficult to move calls around, to ensure the availability, and to defend networks against new kinds of attacks. You know, the unfortunate thing about this, when you get right down to it, in today's modern networks, we don't move things around by moving wires anymore. But for most 911 systems, if you want to make a change, that is literally what it takes. Someone's got to physically go down to a telephone company office and move some wires around on a panel. That's terribly disappointing. It ought to be a lot simpler than that. Well, NG911 changes all of that. It makes it a lot simpler. NG911 has native support for voice, video, text, pictures, and data, and built-in resiliency and reliability features that allow us to do things like reroute calls, efficiently visualize and map where they're coming from in 3 dimensions, which is a big deal in bigger cities. And it also gives us new tools to defend these networks, modern tools, that as long as we live in the telephone network, we simply won't have access to. Another great point about NG911, this is homegrown, high-tech, innovation-focused technology. This is something, it uses the same technology, the same internet-era technologies that Apple and Google and Facebook and Snap use underlying all of their services like iMessage and Snapchat and Facebook Messenger. That's a really powerful thing, because if you want the citizenry to have access to 911 in the way that they communicate, you've got to make it easy for the technology developers and cheap to implement. It's got to be inexpensive. If you can't do those two things, you won't have widespread adoption and you won't get the full advantage of these new technologies that we have. When our folks went and looked at how do we design next generation 911 for the future, that was a key design element, was let's make it easy, let's make it the commercial off-the-shelf technologies that these folks use every day, and let's make it as inexpensive as possible. This also represents a new export for the United States. Already, Next Generation 911 has been adopted as the target goal, as the standard in Canada to our north, and it's being modified a little bit for use in the NG112 systems that will be deployed throughout Europe. So this is something that our homegrown technology is now being exported around the world in a way that will benefit our industry and our global public safety community. We need this technology now. We need NG911 now. The transition costs for local governments, if this transition is delayed, are going to explode. Maintaining legacy infrastructure that you can't get parts for anymore, that you can't get technicians who even remember ever being trained on how to operate it. Doing those things long-term is going to be devastating for the more than 2,000 counties and cities that operate the 6,800 plus public safety answering points, or PSAPs, in the country. Not only that, but delaying the transition will also darken the outlook for our nation's field responders. A number of members of the committee mentioned in their opening statements FirstNet. FirstNet is built on the same sorts of technologies as NG911 and as consumer networks that are transitioning very rapidly to all IP basis, whether it's wireline or wireless. So we need to make sure that we've got the system in the middle that sits between the IP networks for consumers and the ones for FirstNet. Those need to be NG 911. They need to be all IP, and they need to be that now. Congress can accelerate this transition with a one-time injection of federal capital to ensure a coordinated, efficient rollout of shared databases, networks, and systems, and avoid wasteful duplication and proprietary, non-interoperable technology deployment. Madam Chairwoman, I thank you for holding the hearing, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Magnuson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and esteemed committee members. It's a real honor for me to be here today, and as was mentioned earlier, I've been the director at Texas A&M University of the center since 2004. And while it's seen a lot of progress over those years, we still have a long ways to go. However, your support can and will make a big difference in accelerating the nationwide NG 911 transition. I would also like to begin my testimony here this morning by noting that my center does have a contract with the United States Department of Justice for the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice. And while I am testifying today on behalf of my work at Texas A&M University, none of the statements that I make today represent the policies of the United States Department of Justice. Other witnesses have either or will likely talk about what is NG 911 and why is it important. I'd like to take my time to discuss areas where the efforts of this committee and of Congress can really have the most impact. This information is based on a study that we did in 2004 that was funded by the ICERT, the same organization mentioned a few seconds ago. And in essence, there were 4 findings that I have in my recommendations that were based on that study, and really 2 recommendations that come as subsequent issues. So those 6 issues are, number 1, again, is to incentivize states to establish an oversight coordinating authority. Most states have already done this. Most states have coordination within the states. However, in some states, the function of NG 911 is simply a matter of collecting the fees from the telephone companies and passing it on down. While it is possible for a state to implement NG 911 within the state without central coordination, it's actually very, very difficult. So again, anything you could do to resolve that would be greatly appreciated. As Mr. Fogarty, who, by the way, we have worked together for 10 years now. It's been a fantastic relationship, so very, very good person. The second one is really to require federally assisted provided funding to link to the NENA I3 standard. The I3 standard, we began work on it in 2004. It's been adopted by the majority of the 911 industry associations. It is standards-based. It is based on other standardized technologies, such as standards that are adopted by the internet community and by other standards organizations. And in essence, it will ultimately reduce costs and ensure interoperability, and that's very important for public safety. Number 3, provide interim funding. As Mr. Fogarty also just mentioned, while many of the states have been able to go ahead and then get through the process of supporting E911 on their own, there is little doubt that, in essence, the transition to NG 911 is going to incur additional costs during the transition process. We probably can survive on our own once we get through that transition, but in essence, getting through that transition could require a little bit of additional support. Number 4 is to establish a national authority and fund a national NG 911 network to provide interconnectivity between the states. The states are doing a fantastic job of managing resources within the states. However, voice over IP is a national issue. It's a national service. And there is a requirement, in essence, for these state networks to be interconnected. While simply peering between states is possible, it's not the best solution. It's not practical. The 5th one is one that basically comes out of a recent FCC recommendation in the TFOPA document, and it basically calls for the establishment of a centralized or some centralized cybersecurity centers. The unfortunate reality today is that there's a significant shortage of cybersecurity experts in the United States. There's also 6,500 PSAPs, and managing cybersecurity at the PSAP level probably is not possible. And then lastly is to coordinate international 911 efforts between Canada and Mexico. Today, with the E911 system, we actually have calls being routed to the wrong country as a citizen that's close to the border is having lunch on the other side of the border, makes a call, and actually the call gets routed to the wrong country. That's costing time, and obviously an emergency response, time is money, or time is lives. Yesterday, as was noted earlier, was a big day for FirstNet. FirstNet, in essence, now that they're going forward, in essence, they appreciate the fact, in fact, we were talking about it in a panel yesterday, they appreciate the fact that services that will come to them, that will be delivered to first responders, a lot of that information is going to come from the citizens. It will come through NG 911. FirstNet is designed to be voice, video, text. NG 911 would be the mechanism to deliver that. So it is important that this effort happen. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today and look forward to questions.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Boyd, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chairman.
Microphone, please.
Thank you. My apologies. Good morning, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the committee. I am Mary Boyd, Vice President of Regulatory Policy for West Safety Service, but I'm honored to be here this morning really on behalf of the Industry Council for Emergency Response Technologies, often recalled ICERT. ICERT is appreciative of your interest in NG 911 and assisting in the advancement of this technology. I'd also speak to you this morning from my heart. I have been in this business 35 years at local, state government levels, as well as the private sector, but more importantly, my household is public safety. My husband spent his career in law enforcement, and our youngest son, Derry, climbs in an Aerovac helicopter to respond to rural Texas emergencies. So if we can give them the technologies that keep them alive, as well as the people they're trying to save, let's partner to get this done. We've talked this morning about the benefits of Next Gen 911, but I'd like to just focus on a few of the elements that could really help public safety do their job a little bit easier. The simple fact, we've talked about text. We take it for granted that we can text to one another, text to our kids, our grandchildren's photos. But unfortunately, very few of our 911 centers in the country have the ability to receive a text to 911 call. But yet, our speech and hearing impaired community rely on that communication to talk to their families, but they also need to talk to public safety. We have very few, probably 1,000 in the country, of PSAPs that have deployed that. A next-gen infrastructure would make that much easier to deploy throughout the community. The technology companies are ready to do that. We just need the partnership of government. Also, in an era of increased sensitivity to security, national safety, first lines of defense, information is critical. So imagine the ability for a PSAP to receive the photo of a suspect. I suspect any law enforcement entity in this country would value that piece of information instead of getting the verbal description of perhaps they were wearing a t-shirt with blue jeans and a ball cap. We have that technology available today to send the photos in, as well as video. Another benefit of NextGen and an IP network is information about the scene. A helicopter's flying into a rural area in your state in the middle of the night. It would be wonderful for them to know whether they were going to hit utility lines. Are they going to have a fuel storage tank that they're unaware of? Are your volunteer firefighters responding to the same? NextGen 911 affords our first responders wonderful information when it is partnered with FirstNet. Another most valuable benefit of an IP network is the redundancy, resiliency, and basically the ability to move networks, voice, and data around. Today, our 911 centers are tethered with outdated technology from the 70s. We cannot move voice and data easily. So if you have an overburdened 911 center with a spike of call volume, or you have a natural disaster, Vermont is a perfect example with their NextGen system. When the hurricane hit Vermont, they did not lose one 911 call, but yet they did have a PSAP impacted, so they easily changed the traffic to a backup facility. But as I said, unfortunately, most of our technologies today are outdated throughout our public safety agencies, and they do pose a risk when we're trying to advance technologies and aid public safety. ICERT believes that Congress can take a leadership role in a consensus legislation that makes NG 911 funding and implementation a national priority. And we applaud your efforts to take this subject on. And we would also encourage you that if you have a much larger discussion about broadband and funding, that you place NG 911 at the core of those discussions. It's important, as you indicated, that we do recall Congress played a critical role in our country for the initial deployment of 911. In fact, some of my systems we updated in Texas were from the old LEAA funds. So we think it's very appropriate that you look at Next Gen 911 funding, as indicated by Walt and Trey, just for the capital upfront cost for local government, state and local government. We're not asking Congress to endure the entire cost, but we do know that we have an impediment today because funds are lacking at the state level to cover the upfront implementation. So members, we want to thank you for your time this morning. I know I'm running very short and I feel like I've just given you a drink out of a fire hose, but 911 cannot fall behind. FirstNet and NG 911 should be partnered. We thank this committee for this opportunity. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Ritter, you are recognized 5 minutes.
Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm honored to share the story of success in the great state of Indiana. Thank you, Mrs. Brooks, for that kind introduction. In 1996, the General Assembly created the Wireless Advisory Board, the predecessor to the now statewide 911 Board. Established as a body corporate and politic, it is separate from state government. However, the board's powers constitute an essential government function. This board is chaired by the state treasurer, a single elected official, which we credit for the success that we have shared in Indiana. As the state's 911 authority, the board has two primary responsibilities. The first is to oversee the statewide 911 system that has been and will be deployed across the state. The second is to administer the funding that supports that uniform statewide 911 program. Established as a state trust fund, the funds have a targeted use authorized by statute. Our funds have never been diverted or raided in the state. This governance model permitted the board to deploy wireless 911 service and now Next Gen 911 service on a very aggressive schedule. Generation 1 of the original wireless network began in 2004 and was completed in 2006. This work brought the cost of wireless 911 under control and began the goal of uniform service. Completed in 2010, Generation 2 included the build-out of our ESI net and established connectivity to all bordering counties in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. Those bordering PSAPs now have the ability to transfer calls and handset location information across state lines. In 2013, as part of the board's strategic plan for next-gen services, the board commissioned a statewide study of the PSAP's legacy networks and call processing equipment. The estimated cost to replace the networks and the PSAP equipment county by county was enormous. A decision was made to manage the transition to next-gen 911 networks as a statewide project under the authority of the board. In 2014, the board published their first request seeking proposals for next-gen service compliant with NENA's I3 standard. In 2015, the board awarded contracts for dual networks. The new IN 911 network will operate as a public-private partnership with two private vendors. The dual network design was a cost-effective solution and leveraged efficiencies from two providers. The ESI nets operate independently and are responsible for specific service areas. However, they connect at the core to provide redundant services. The board also required the primary vendor to deploy a third-tier disaster recovery service. This further ensures that calls can be delivered statewide anytime. And finally, the board contracted with a third-party network for monitoring and data analytics. Scheduled for completion in the fourth quarter of 2017, all PSAPs will be served by the new next-gen networks. Purchased as a service, the board's annual cost will only be approximately $15 million to serve all 92 counties. Indiana's statewide 911 program benefits from the efficiencies provided by modern technologies such as hosted solutions. We believe that our design and implementation can serve as a model for other state and/or regional programs. Our next priority will be to assist local government in replacing their legacy call processing equipment, some of which is not capable of processing the many type of emergency calls that can be generated by the public today. It is important to understand that funding alone is not enough to achieve Next Gen in the U.S. Leadership, collaboration, and cooperation between local, state, and federal government, and between industry partners and industry associations is a must. That leadership needs to start here at the federal level. 911 will continue to be a local service, but it needs strong leadership and a spotlight on the methods that are proven to get results. Sustainable funding, strategic planning, and advocacy for non-proprietary standards support Next-Gen initiatives. We recognize that Next-Gen networks, while separate from FirstNet, will serve a critical role in the larger public safety initiative. Citizens reporting an emergency could improve public safety using video, pictures, or other data which can be processed and delivered to the PSAP. A FirstNet connected PSAP could then relay the same information to and receive from first responders data to improve public safety. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter. Mr. Souter, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, good morning. Members of the committee, good morning. Thank you again for having me here. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm pleased to say and proud to say that I have been in 911 since the first 911 call was made on February 16th of 1968. I could replicate by reading my testimony many of the remarks that my colleagues have made before me, but I'm instead, with your permission, going to speak from my heart. In the 20 minutes that we have been testifying here, there have been 5,000 911 calls made in the United States of America. By the end of this day, there'll be 240,000 calls made, and by the end of this year, 87 million calls made. 911 is the most recognized number in the United States. It is a go-to number every time there is an emergency. It is predicated upon technology that was developed in the 1960s. If any of us had an antique car that was built in the 1960s, we'd be proud to have a license plate that had adorned to it, antique. That's exactly what our system is today. It is old, it is still reliable, but in no way is as good as it needs to be. In my hand and in your pocket, we probably have a smartphone. Residing in that smartphone is computing power greater than was used to launch Apollo 11 to the moon in 1969, 1 year after 911 was deployed. And yet, for all of us here, if we had to call 911 from this room, we would simply put 911, and all we would get would be a voice connection. We could not in any way utilize this technology, which each of us and each of our citizens across this nation have, to identify where we are, to send photographs or videos or medical data that's relative to where we are or a patient's condition. Yesterday morning at the Commerce Department auditorium, I had the privilege with other public safety professionals to attend the FirstNet Authority's Board of Directors meeting when they approved the awarding of an award that will allow the FirstNet network to be built out. After that was announced, a number of public safety, law enforcement, fire rescue, EMS chiefs and so forth got up to speak. And each of them said that with this technology, they will be able to, in the future, provide a higher level of information and technology to the field forces that are responding to an emergency. And that is absolutely true. But 911 has to stay pace with that. And Next Generation 911 gives the 911 community and your citizens the ability to access and to provide that information in the future. How much it will cost, I do not know. I do know this, that in 1972, the United States government as a means of promoting and advocating and encouraging the deployment of basic 911 back then, established, as Mary Boyd said, through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, a grant program that would allow for communities to be funded so that they could kickstart their initial 911 system. That was then, and this is now. And I would suggest to you that America's 911 systems need another kickstart, a kickstart that can start right here in the Congress of the United States. To Mr. Walden's comments earlier, I noted with interest his comment about fee diversion. There's a list of those states that divert fees. I know when I get my phone bill, and probably when you get yours, there is listed a 911 fee, a charge, or a tax. It's called different things in different communities. But the expectation is, by you, me, and us, that that 911 fee or tax is going to go to funding and improving the 911 systems. If that money is being diverted for whatever the reason, that is not good. And I, like my colleagues, welcome your remarks in the future, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. At this time, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions as we begin that part of our hearing. And Mr. Souter, I want to stay with you, if I may. You talk a little bit about the antique model that we've existed under and needing to kickstart something to boost the NG 911. And in your testimony, you talked a little bit about economy of scale in the deployment of NG 911. I want you to talk just a moment about that economy of scale and why you think that's important to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, economy of scale. We all know what is behind that term, but as it applies to 911, it means this. Currently, there are 6,800 911 centers in the United States. By and large, each of them have within their facility equipment that drives the 911 system within that 911 center, if you will. When we move to next generation 911 through various technologies, there is the ability to have those same centers now simply provide the service, but have it hosted by a computer, a router, or whatever the equipment would be that would be centrally located and really providing the connectivity and the network to those 911 centers that ultimately use it. So we think smart and go about this in a way that capitalizes upon the power that we have today with technology. We can deploy next generation 911 in a more cost-effective way in that we won't have to replicate every single piece of equipment in every PSAP that exists today.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Magnuson, you mentioned cost studies in your testimony, and the FCC did one in 2011. It wasn't comprehensive, but I noted that there was a substantial difference in outcomes between the estimate based on the current 911 system at the time and one where there was a consolidation of the PSAPs, and the PSAPs opted for hosted solutions. And I think the dollar difference was $2.68 billion versus $1.44 billion. I would love for you to talk for a moment about hosted solutions, what that means in context, and how that will help to drive the cost lower. Microphone.
Sorry. Consolidation has been a controversial term in the 911 community for a long time because there's always been a desire to have the call takers be locally hosted, locally available. However, as was just mentioned a second ago by my esteemed colleague, you know, in essence, by putting the technology in a cloud architecture, in essence, you can still do the local call receiving, the local call taking, but you're really doing resource sharing, and that's really what it's all about. It's because the technology is all about, it's the bigger part of the cost. Keep in mind that most of the cost borne in the PSAPs, actually from the staffing level and the building level, is really done locally anyway. It's not typically out of the funds that we're talking about that really end up funding 911 here. So realistically, being able to provide the local control of the people, and another big difference needs to be understood in this too. And what we're talking about doing cloud services, for the most part, these are done in what we call a private cloud. It really scares the public safety community when you start talking about doing it on the internet because of the security issues and everything else there. The emergency services IP networks that we're talking about are based on the same technology and infrastructure as the internet, but they're not the internet. It's a private internet connection. So in essence, we can still manage the security and reliability, but have the benefits of the resource sharing. That's the whole premise of NG 911.
So you're tying back to what Mr. Souter said on economies of scale with that.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Fogarty, I saw you shaking your head as if you wanted to add something to the discussion.
So I want to completely agree with and associate myself with the remarks made both by Mr. Souter and by Mr. Magnuson. We have evidence already that economies of scale can tremendously benefit the 911 community. In the state of Washington, they have deployed an existing sort of E911 solution, but they've moved it into a hosted kind of fashion where instead of buying 80 or 90 widgets, they buy 3 of them, put them in, secure, high reliability data centers, connect folks to them with redundant connectivity, and their connectivity costs, even engineering that for redundancy and so forth, fell by half. I mean, that is a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous savings and a tremendous benefit to public safety by moving to hosted systems, shared services, shared databases. These things don't have to be unique around the country.
Thank you for that. And in Tennessee, we would say that falls in the category, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. My time has expired. Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My first question is to Ms. Boyd specifically, or also to anyone else on the panel that feels qualified to answer. What are the major challenges to integrating emerging Internet of Things technologies into our 911 systems? Do you think that the current and emerging standards will support the types of technologies and volumes of data that are being anticipated? I know that, for example, technologies like Nest Home Protect, while the device will notify the consumer of an accident, it's still up to the consumer to call 911. How do you see this dynamic evolving, and do you anticipate next-gen 911 systems being able to accommodate these technologies?
Yes, sir. Mr. Doyle, the IP infrastructure in a next-gen environment allows the technologies that you've just mentioned to be able to come into the 911 network or into the Public Safety Communications Center. Today, in that analog world, it's very limited, just a telephone number and an address, basically. When you have a collision, crash notification data, that can all come in through the network in secure and also manageable ways so that the communication centers are not overwhelmed with the amount of data. That is a concern you might hear from public safety is, how do I manage all this additional information? It will be basically parsed, and perhaps the street doesn't need that information right now as first responders, but yet it's available to perhaps investigators that need it later. So an IP infrastructure really allows, in a secure, protected, private network environment, the transmission of alarm system information, crash notification data, personal medical information. Did I answer your question, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the, is anyone else want to add to that? Mr. Fogarty?
I'll jump in here just to say that...
Fogarty, sorry.
That's all right. I'll jump in just to say that the Internet of Things is something that for a long time has generated a lot of angst in public safety. We're worried about, do we really want every smoke detector out there able to call 911? And I think historically the answer would have been no, simply because the only thing it could do was detect whether 2 wires had crossed or a beam of light had been broken or something like that. Today, though, we're getting to the point where sensors don't work on a one-off basis. We're getting to the point where you can have a collection of sensors in a house or an apartment that notice with high confidence that there's a fire. If the sprinkler water is flowing, if you see a heat flare, if there's smoke detected, and so on, you put all those things together and you can come to the conclusion that, yeah, there might really be a fire there. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on that, but we absolutely believe that in the future we'll have that ability to take in IoT alerts like that and process them intelligently. We have to make sure that we do that so that the PSAPs are not overwhelmed. As Mary said, we've got to bring in those new automation tools into public safety as well. NG 911 allows us to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Ritter, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Sauter, did you want to add to that?
Mr. Doyle, thank you. 2 years ago, the Federal Communications Commission established the Task Force on Optimal PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point Architecture. It had nothing to do with brick and mortar, but it had everything to do with the technology infrastructure that would allow for the very items that you talk to be accommodated in a next-generation world. That task force was comprised of 40 people from 911 profession and industry, representing 800 years of 911 experience. And they produced, in December of last year, a roadmap, for all practical purposes, a roadmap for any elected, appointed, or local official to follow to help in deploying next-generation 911 and to consider and accommodate all of the various points that you made, and thank you for making them.
Thank you, Mr. Sauter. Mr. Ritter, in your testimony, you noted that while Next-Gen 911 is separate from FirstNet, the two are somewhat connected in a larger public safety broadband initiative. I believe Next-Gen 911 is an essential link in this chain. You have people who, more often than not, are contacting 911 through a smartphone, and you will have first responders using FirstNet's smart technology on the other end. The 911 call center is what connects these two pieces together. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what Indiana is doing with its FirstNet project and how that fits into your state's Next-Gen 911 plans?
Yes, thank you. The state of Indiana, through their single point of contact, is led through the Integrated Public Safety Commission that is responsible for the LMR system across the state. And through that agency, I serve on an executive committee as we have began to do our analysis and the draft of the state plan that has been submitted for review. We anticipate that in the future, should Indiana, the governor, make the decision to opt in or opt out of this initiative, our next generation system will be in place and operable for citizens to be able to communicate the technologies that's been spoken of here today to the PSAP. We envision then the FirstNet network or broadband initiative to be the tool that delivers the data from the PSAP to the first responders, and in turn, what a first responder may encounter back to the PSAP.
All right, Mr. Latta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses for being here today. It's a very important topic, and I'd like to start, if I could, Mr. Ritter. I have 5 counties that run parallel, or I should say, are made down the Ohio-Indiana line. I was kind of interested in what you were talking about when you're talking about the counties across the state line with Indiana, how you're working with them. Now, how does that work? So if for calls coming in and out, because again, I'm just about halfway down the state of Indiana that I have a border with you all.
Yes, the current vendor who operates the original wireless network in the state, at the request of the counties, not only in Indiana, but those in Ohio, we're encountering a large number of transfers from the motoring public when the call comes from a wireless device. And we had no way to transfer other than voice. And between the PSAP managers and elected officials in those jurisdictions, we agreed to build our existing network to those individual PSAPs in Ohio that would provide the telecommunicator the opportunity to not only transfer the voice in a 911 call, but the associated call data today, the Annie and the Alley, to that adjoining PSAP in the event that the motorist was to travel into Ohio. And we are limited to the ability to transfer that specific data today on our existing network.
Okay, now does the county have to have, years ago I was a county commissioner in Ohio, and we were also responsible for our 911 systems and working with them. Do they have to have the equipment, or what else would an Ohio county have to have?
Today, they were able to use their existing equipment through their 911 system service provider, and the connection occurs between our vendor in Indiana and the service provider in Ohio.
Okay, thank you. If I could ask Mr. Souter a follow-up. When you were talking in regards to the, our more antiquated system that we have out there, you said that if you have a vehicle back from 1968 being antique, actually in Ohio, after you hit 25 years, you get an antique plate. But, how do we go forward? Because you're mentioning, especially again with if you're out someplace, let's say there's an accident, can't you triangulate from a cell phone from an enhanced 911 to that spot today under the existing system that we have?
The existing system that we have today relative to mobile phones, who, by the way, are the source of about 80% of 911 calls received in the United States. In a way, it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to 911 wireless phones. But it also had its own drawbacks because now instead of getting one call reporting a traffic accident on an interstate, now you get 100 phone calls reporting a traffic accident on an interstate. But in this case, more is better than less. But to your point, the cellular tone today integrates very well into the legacy network. However, and this is a big however, it does not bring with it the absolute location of that particular call. If you were to call 911 from your home wireline phone, if you had one, there's no doubt about it that the 911 call will be received with the exact address from which that wireline went. But when a wireless world, that's not the case at all. At a previous hearing in this building, in this room, I tried a 911 call from within this chamber. And identified me as being on Independence Avenue, southeast. Not a very good thing if you're having a heart attack. And that is one of the big drawbacks that goes with wireless 911 calls in a legacy network. Wireless 911 calls in a next generation network will bring to you the absolute location of that phone. Today, you might not, or maybe would, be surprised to hear that if you were to call a pizza inn to Papa John, they would know where you are. But if you were to call 911, they may not know where you are.
Okay. Well, it's a very, very important topic. And when I was a commissioner, we worked very closely with our sheriffs because our sheriffs are the ones that run the 911 system in the state of Ohio. And again, as you say, when you're looking at, we have interstate highway system that runs through our county and my district, and so being able to get those calls is so important for our law enforcement and especially our sheriffs because they're the ones that have got the equipment, they're the ones that are running it. But really appreciate you all being here and your testimony today. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yells back. Ms. Eshoo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to each one of the witnesses for the work and the experience of your life that you bring to us. It's very rich and it's enriching to us in your testimony. There are a couple of things that I want to mention that I'm really very, very proud of. I don't know if, John Shimkus he was here earlier, but has left. We founded at that time, it was called the E911 Caucus in the House, and it was also established in the Senate with Senator Conrad Burns and Senator Clinton at that time. So we're still the originals around here for that caucus and proud of it. And we've been able to bring many of the issues that we're talking about today forward. I also am proud of the fact that while Congress had dealt with the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, there was one that Congress had not made good on, and that was to establish a nationwide interoperable public safety network. And I carried the legislation successfully, and it became law. So now here we are. We've got different parts of different systems and different technologies, and there's something unsettling to me about it because it's 2017. And I don't think that we have made the headway that we should. This is not fault or blame. I would recommend, Madam Chair, that at some point we have a hearing where we bring in the NTIA and NHTSA and FirstNet, because they're the implementers of this. And I think it needs a revving up. I really do. Having said that, we have 6,800 PSAPs in the country, I think. It's in someone's testimony or maybe the committee memo. Let me ask Mr. Souter, how would you characterize the progress being made over that landscape, the 6,800?
Each state and each community within it has the option as to how they will utilize 911 as we have known it in the past. And I would suggest to you, looking to the future, that control of 911 should still be a local effort, whether it be at the county or the local level.
I'm from county government, so I'm very familiar with the operations locally.
And it is for them to decide whether or not they need whatever they have currently, if you will. To several of our witnesses that commented that you can continue to have your local 911 center staffed by local people. However, it can be hosted by technology that is far removed from that. So you have the dual benefit, if you will, of local engagement, but at the same time an economy of scale by nature of the way you deploy the hardware.
I do think, I appreciate that. I do think that, and I was going to repeat the story of your making the telephone call from the Rayburn building, and your call was answered, but you were told by the public safety operator that your location could not be determined. Now, this is from a traditional landline, multi-line telephone system. This is not uncommon in our country. And I think Congress really needs to push hard on location technology because we comfort ourselves that we have an emergency system in the country, but if the first responders can't find the person that's experiencing the emergency, well, really, what kind of a system is that? What kind of a system is that? So I think we need to ride hard on that. Mr. Souter, what would you recommend to us to do about fee diversion?
The issue of fee diversion is monitored closely by the Federal Communications Commission. Again, because 911 is funded locally, it is the decision of local policymakers as to what to do with that money. I would only imagine that various statutes that give rise to the fee or the tax or the surcharge can be interpreted one way or another at a local level as to whether or not they really have to divert all of that money into 911, or maybe they can re-divert it into something else. Clearly, for those states that have that interpreted flexibility, I would ask that they go back and they look at that with a close eye. We all know the economy that we work in. We all know how tight funds are. But it's very, very important that as a taxpayer, if you are paying tax for a particular service, that that's in fact where that tax goes.
But what would you do, though? I mean, you explained how it's working.
Well,
Lady's
And it's
time has
local.
expired.
I don't know what I'd do, but I could make a couple of suggestions that to the degree that the Congress in its wisdom sees fit to establish perhaps a next generation grant program, that there could be embedded in that grant program criteria that would say that if you are eligible for the grant, there are certain things that you have to comply with or cease to do, and if there is current fee diversion going on, you're not eligible for a grant until that is addressed.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Magnuson, are you familiar with the FCC's 2013 report to Congress regarding Next Gen 911? I'm sure it was a bestseller, well read, widely read.
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, so according to that report, some of the participants called for the federal government to establish certain databases to support Next Gen 911. Could you briefly describe those databases and the function they provide?
Okay, okay, thank you, Chair, I appreciate it. Okay. One of them actually is, it was what we refer to, again, we refer to in the industry as a forest guide. The forest guide gets to the point that I was talking about, having a a national level database that understands the interconnection points between the states. Again, it is really important that within the states they manage their call routing and everything else. But what is often the case today is that, for example, you have a visitor here in Washington, D.C., but their home service is back in Texas. And when that happens, actually that call is routed back to Texas, and that Texas service has to understand where that person is. So again, we use a system called a forest guide, to where at the local level they try to determine the location to route that call to, the PSAP to route it to. If it can't determine at the local level, it goes to a higher level. And then at higher level, then would take it to Washington, D.C. and say, where is Walt right now? And the call would be routed appropriately. The database that understands the relationships between the states and is able to handle the call processing between the states is what we call the forest guide. And that is something that currently doesn't exist, and unfortunately one of the larger issues is it really doesn't have a home today. In other words, is it a responsibility of the U.S. Department of Transportation through NHTSA? Is it OEC? Is it who? Where does that lie? And that hasn't been determined.
Well, good. I know that a lot of these reports do get produced, and it's good to have people who read them, understand them, and can give expert testimony, so we appreciate the value of that. Mr. Ritter, you mentioned FirstNet. FirstNet is an IP network, and we were talking about IP networks when we talk about NextGen 911. Do you have any thoughts on how these networks should be integrated, or do they have to be integrated?
From Indiana's perspective, I would envision the integration being at the PSAP level, that our current NextGen network would operate independent from a FirstNet broadband, and the integration is through the workflow in the PSAP to the first responder.
Okay, to the PSAP. So what is that? Can you explain that a little bit?
The 911 center.
Okay, the 911 center. Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Boyd, and it's when you get questions prepared, Mr. Sutter almost talked about this some, but I'd like for you to talk about it as well. He said you agree with Mr. Ritter, you seem to agree with Mr. Ritter that a greater federal role is needed. It seems to me your focus is on the funding side of it. And Mr. Ritter has testified that funding alone is not the answer. And my question is, you agree with that, and you state that you're a strong supporter of local government control but call for more federal involvement. And just, is funding alone is not the answer, and do you agree? And the second one is, how do you reconcile a greater federal role but keep it local? And then Mr. Souter kind of talked about that a minute ago, but just to reemphasize.
Mr. Guthrie, our company and the members of ICER are very large supporters of local control. But what we are void of right now is a policy authority that would set a date and a time to actually put our country in a next-gen 911 technology. If you look historically, for any deployment of technology, whether it was the TTY deployments with the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether it was wireless, whether it was VoIP, whether even our state planning, I think Barry would agree, we had dates that we had to meet. So Congress could be the policy authority that also helps with the initial grant funding and also sets the expectation as a policy body that we have to achieve these deployments. So it's multifaceted. And do that also on a regional and statewide coordinated basis, so we can get the economies of scale, and that also works parallel with FirstNet.
I understand that the local and the coordinating, because as Dr. Magnuson said, if I call 911 now, it would go through, and I don't know, somehow I would think I'm in Kentucky. That's my local exchange, and you have to all these systems work together. And we appreciate this. It's been very informative to me, someone who's certainly not an expert in this at all, but it's very informative, and I appreciate your testimony. I yield back 5 seconds.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I understand that FirstNet is on the verge of an historic announcement of a private partner, and despite a lot of doubters along the way, this announcement is the culmination of years of work and will begin the next phase of deployment, getting us this far towards a nationwide interoperable public safety network was a signature accomplishment of the Obama administration. So, Ms. Boyd, I wanted to ask you, how important is the successful implementation of FirstNet to the transition to NG 911?
Mr. Pallone, in my opinion, coming both from government and 911 background, as well as from the industry perspective, they are very important and they should be partnered. When our citizens call 911, that's coming in, from a voice or a text, could be a text connection, but without integrating into FirstNet, which is the radio network, our first responders will not have all that wonderful data that we're able to transmit through smart devices. So they need to be planned and integrated together. One without the other will basically be somewhat ineffective in terms of maximizing the efficiencies of those technologies. Does that make sense? So as Barry had indicated, at the 911 center, when you have voice and data coming in, it's the radio network that's actually getting the information out to the first responders. So through 911, that data would be handed off and integrated into the radio communications network.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We've also noted how states put a fee on their citizens' phone bill that says it's for 911, but too many states, including my own, then use that money for different purposes, and I think that's deceptive and dangerous. So, Mr. Souter, can you please tell us why diverting 911 fees is so harmful to the life-saving transition to next-generation systems?
Anytime a 911 system is dependent upon tax dollars, they're dependent upon all of the tax dollars that were intended to be received. When you divert funds from that revenue stream, you obviously are going to have an impact in one way or another in the operation of that 911 center, whether it's technology, whether it's administration, whether it's personnel, or what it may be. So to pinch that revenue stream and reduce it by varying degrees has a definite correlation to the efficiency of the 911 center and the level of service that they can provide to the very citizen that paid that tax, expecting that all of it would go to the center.
All right, thanks. I wanted to ask you another question. In your testimony, you indicate that ignoring Next Generation 911 is, I quote, not an option, and I agree. I also understand that money alone will not solve the problem, but I think adequate funding is the foundation for any serious conversation about upgrading our systems, and that's why I think passing a national infrastructure bill presents us with a unique opportunity to get this done the right way. So, Mr. Souter, you mentioned in your testimony ways to fund the transition by using an NG operational paradigm model. Can you explain to us what that means?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Generally speaking, Next Generation 911 is viewed as a technology initiative, but the reality is that it is, in my opinion, a three-pronged initiative. One, technology for sure, and that has consumed most of what we've talked about today. But the other two parts of that are the governance of that and the funding of that. We've talked a little bit about the funding, but very little about the governance. So I think it's very important because Next 911 is administered locally and should be, you've heard that said many times, that we use this opportunity to take a fresh look at the way in which we both fund, the way in which we govern, and the way in which we deploy technology so that the three are working in harmony with each other for the collective benefit that they will bring.
All right, thank you. I want to get one more question into Mr. Fogarty. Senate Democrats recently unveiled a bill that could help finally deliver on the promise of Next Generation 911. Can you tell me what you think about that bill, if you could.
Congressman, I think there's a lot to like in the discussion draft that was circulated in the Senate. We certainly came out strongly supporting that language. I think there are other things certainly that we'd like to see, in a bill like that as well, and we're certainly willing to work with the committee on that. One of the things Chairwoman Blackburn mentioned earlier was the success of states that have 911 boards. And I think coming from Tennessee, and that speaks particularly powerfully to me because in my home state, in Tennessee, our former 911 director, Lynn Questel, would always, wherever she went, she would tell people, if you want 911 to be successful, have a board. Get people from the legislature, from the regulators, from the industry, from the public safety professionals, get them together and work on it collectively, and you'll be much more successful. So those are the kinds of things, we think can make the bill even stronger.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Gentleman yields back, and Mr. Shimkus, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's great to have you all here. And Ms. Ferguson, I want to just kind of follow up on Ranking Member Pullen's question, because I don't know the answer on this. But the question is premised on that some states' regulations are based upon legacy technologies. Does the Senate bill address this issue, or how do you think that challenge can be addressed?
So that's actually something the FCC report required by the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, something that report addressed based on our comments, actually. In your home state, the counties of Southern Illinois, I think it was a 17-county region, they got together and said, we want to put together a next-generation 911 network and system. We want to go out and be first on this issue. They ran into a regulatory morass. They spent years trying to figure out how can we do this as counties, how can we go out and build this thing collectively, because they didn't fit neatly into the right boxes. They weren't a telecom, they weren't a phone company, and historically the rules were written so that you had to be a phone company to do some of these things. So I think one of the things that we talked about in our comments to the FCC was that, we may need some kind of backstopping federal regulations that say, look, this is new technology, and, the old regulations, if they're not done away with at some point, we've just got to say, look, you can petition the FCC or you can just go and build, but you've got to be able to deploy these new technologies without these legacy barriers.
Thank you very much. And I don't want to beat up on my own state, but this does give me the platform to do that every now and then, and I don't think that's bad policy sometimes. We are one of the diverting states now. We didn't used to be. We held firm, but we are such a dysfunctional state budgetary-wise. So I think the report says about 5.2% transferred to the general fund. So I'm just calling my state out on that. Mr. Ritter, though, in your testimony, because you're my neighbor, you mentioned Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, but obviously you left out interoperability across the state lines in Illinois. In fact, I pulled out your Exhibit A and drew this big circle, and that's my district. It abuts all of southwestern Indiana. You want to comment on that? Why are you not helping Illinois out, I guess is
It's not personal, sir. Much to Trey's comment, when we began to look at Illinois to partner with, as we had the other states, we hit regulatory issues. And there were limitations that inhibited our ability to build our network on our dime into your state to provide those critical services.
I guess that's it. Thank you. And let me finish up with Dr. Magnuson. If the federal government were going to be involved, there's that debate, right? We've done FirstNet, there's a pot of money. I think the question is there going to be another pot of money? Do you have any idea, ballpark, soup to nuts, of how much this, to get us to where a lot of people in this sector would like us to be, what that would be?
The center that I direct has been working for several recent months on an interim study. The interim study basically is what I'm going to call a back-of-the-napkin type study because of the fact that the challenge we're running into is when you start to look at what it's going to cost, you really need solid data. And again, so few states have really done this, and there's so much variance in what it would cost from state to state. Coming up with an accurate number is very difficult. I would anticipate that probably within about the next 3-4 weeks, our interim study will be ready. Now, the interim study is only that. In essence, right now, there is a study being done by the NG 911 office that will be out later on this fall, and that will be the authoritative study. That one actually has been funded and will, in essence, really give a much, much better determination of what those total costs are. I have worked with the people that are doing it. They've got some really, really very good people working on it. They do have the same challenge we did, though, and that's that when you do a study and you don't have a whole lot of solid data to base it on, it's hard.
I appreciate it, Madam Chair. You'll let my time.
Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. I thank our expert witnesses for lending your expertise. It's very important issue for our nation. This question is for Mr. Magnuson. The 911 call centers by design are an interconnect point for the public to first responders. As such, they could be an attractive target for possible cyber attacks that can have serious repercussions to the public. We have already seen current analog systems compromised by simple cyber attacks such as telephony, denial of service, and radio frequency jamming. New next-gen 911 will not be immune to attacks. We must plan for strong cyber defense sooner than later. And clearly ensuring that next-gen 911 systems is secure will save lives. During your testimony this morning, you made a number of references in this regard. Have these issues been taken into account when planning next-generation 911 systems? And is there a need for additional funding necessary to ensure security is baked into the next-generation 911 systems?
Thank you for the question. If you look at the architecture that NG911 is based upon, one of the devices you have at the edge of the network is called a BCF. It stands for Border Control Function. And in layperson's terms, that's basically a firewall on steroids. So yes, it is designed into the architecture. Yes, it will be built in. And a BCF is pretty much a required function of every one of the EZNets. The centralized monitoring facility, though, that I talked about a little bit earlier, is really kind of a key function behind that. It's in essence a second layer up, because there will be a large number of EZNets. Each one of those EZNets will have one of these border functions. Unfortunately, hackers are very smart, and they seem to have a lot of time on their hands. So what, in essence, the problem is an attack on one hardened area could easily be moved to another area. So the function of these central monitoring facilities would have a global view, and as an attack occurs, in essence, that attack would be understood what's going on to help shut things down, but more importantly, also then make sure that that same attack is not invoked on the neighboring PSAP.
And so the concern then becomes information sharing, right? So we witnessed an attack in one part of the system, that there's a mechanism in place so that that information is shared in real time. Is that also part of what you envision or part of what is being discussed and planned?
Exactly, because again, attacks typically are almost like a virus. They keep changing themselves to do what they were intended to do, which is damage. And in essence, you have to stay, it has to be a real-time active process.
Did anyone else want to add any comments to that? Mr. Fogarty.
So I appreciate your asking about cybersecurity, because this is something our organization has been focused on for about the last 2 years very intensely. Even before that, our standards developers created something called the NGSec, or Next Generation 911 Security Standard. It goes far beyond just firewalls and border control functions, establishes defense in depth. This is a key point. Today's telephone network systems are vulnerable to attack. For a long time, we thought they weren't, and we acted like they weren't in the PSAP community, and we didn't defend them. The challenge is we don't have tools to defend them in the telephone network. People have said, well, won't the move to IP introduce new vulnerabilities, new attack surfaces, and so forth? And the answer to that is yes, of course it will. But the other thing that it does, the most important thing, is it gives us tools to fight back. It gives us tools to defend our networks that in the telephone world we simply don't have. And that's another reason it's so important that we move to Next Generation 911 soon.
Very well. This question is for Ms. Boyd. In your testimony, you discussed the need for Congress to take a bipartisan approach to develop legislation to make Next Generation 911 a national priority. Can you please elaborate on what this legislation should look like and how Congress can take the appropriate steps?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. If I were going to frame the policy, I would establish, one, the grant system that allows for the upfront, non-recurring capital investment for the areas. I'd also consider that in that you establish planning timeframes and deployment timeframes, working with the states. It's always partnered with the states and local government. But I would also encourage Congress not to just focus funding the initial upfront for areas that haven't deployed, I think it's only fair that you also look to perhaps Mr. Ritter in Indiana. He may have elements that are still needed within his next generation 911 infrastructure that he could use funding and grant assistance for. So the policy framework really would be enabling grant distribution, setting a time frame for deployment, and the expectation that our country is going to be NG 911.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I want to thank the panel for being here as well today. I'm the former chairman, as is Ms. Brooks as well, of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications under the Homeland Security Committee, so we really are interested in this subject. Ms. Fogarty, can you briefly explain the particular benefits of the Next Generation 911 for the blind, deaf, visually impaired, hearing impaired, that are not currently available through the analog 911 services?
That's an incredibly important question, Mr. Bilirakis, and I really appreciate your bringing it up. In the United States today, there are more than 38 million, I believe, deaf, hard of hearing, or speech impaired individuals. Historically, their access to emergency communications was greatly restricted by limitations of networks and systems. It was only after the federal government mandated that TTY technology, the ability to type characters over the telephone line using analog tones, only after that was required that service became available over 911. The great thing is, if you look at the work that our standards developers did with NG 911, they baked those functionalities in deeply into NG 911. Support not only for message-based text, but for real-time text, character by character that has the same conversational flow as a TTY. The ability to do multi-party video calling, so you can have a sign language interpreter available so that you can do things like interact with someone who is blind and sort of see, be their eyes for them if need be. All of those things are natively supported in NG 911. And from the standpoint of the PSAP community, it makes it far easier for our members to provide service to these more vulnerable aspects of our population in the ways that they communicate already. And that's a key thing, is we want to make 911 service available to people in the way that they're used to communicating. It shouldn't be some rare oddball thing. It should just happen the way you do it every day. And that's very important to us.
Very good. My district represents a significantly large population in the Tampa Bay area of seniors as compared to most congressional districts. What benefits do the Next Generation 911 provide for our nation's seniors who are most likely to request emergency call centers and need emergency services?
So I'll point to two things in particular. Contrary to some, media characterizations, senior Americans are some of the fastest technology adopters. They actually end up using video calling and text messaging just as quickly as the average teenagers do, and love the technology. I mean, video calling with your grandmother is now, a common everyday thing. So these technologies will benefit seniors. The other thing that was mentioned before is the Internet of Things. We're seeing a phenomenal growth in new wearable technologies that principally focus on health and security. I mean, these are things that Americans care about and that our innovators are building products for. As that happens, as more of those things come online and as we get used to them in the 911 community, I think there's going to come a point where, because the standards allow for it, we're going to start to see alerts coming in from those things so that we can respond and so that we can know, for example, and this is a big NG 911 feature, if a consumer wants to make health data available when they call 911, something like, hey, I'm a diabetic, hey, I'm a hemophiliac, I have a heart condition, whatever that is, they can do that securely through a trusted third party. They don't have to share their data with the government up front. And that makes it much easier for responders in the field to provide good service.
Very good. Anyone else want to respond to this subject matter, whether it's disabled in general, senior population, what have you? Anyone else want to?
Could I just?
Yeah, please, go ahead. Yes.
I think another benefit is, as we do have an aging population, and and want to live at home, right? Added to the medical information that they can personalize and send to 911 and the first responders is also the ability to notify a third party if they wanted to. So you say, you know, my parents, if they were living, they dialed 911, I could know they had called, and they could set that up and pre-plan. So, and once again, the next generation technology affords so much added benefit in data.
Is that technology available currently?
Yes, sir, it is.
Oh, great. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. So as Trey had indicated, you know, it's the ability, if you choose to share the information with first responders, we can arm them as they're en route to know that I have medical emergencies or that, you know, I have a third party to be notified. And that would help them as they are also trying to find loved ones and notify them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else? Yes, please.
I did. Thank you. Healthcare is changing in the United States of America, legislation aside. There are technologies presently available and on the horizon that will allow and mandate that healthcare of the future is as different in the future as 911 will be different in the future. It is incredibly important that as that technology advances for all segments of our population, that they can take full advantage of that technology when they need to call 911. Whether it's body-worn technology, whether it's pre-entered profile technology, whether it's medication technology, whatever it may be, but the next generation of 911, when deployed, will be able to communicate that both to the first responders that we spoke about earlier through the FirstNet network, but also to the hospital staff, so that when a patient arrives at the hospital, there are many things about that patient that will already be known by the attending people in the ER. Very, very important.
Very good. Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Chairwoman. Ms. Boyd, your testimony mentions the benefits of next generation 911, including providing increased reliability and resilience of the network, particularly in times of emergency and high use. And I know that in my district that when we had a tornado that killed 161 people in a town of 50,000 right after I'd been here for 5 months, I know how important the 911 is. Can you explain how next generation 911 can provide such increased reliability and resilience?
Yes, sir. In a IP advanced architecture, different than what we have today with the legacy analog, today's networks are very tethered. That's the best way to explain them. They're fixed, they're not dynamic, and they don't move. So in a next-gen world, in an IP world, we regionally plan or statewide plan in Missouri for next-gen. If you had another unfortunate event as the tornado, that impacted PSAP. One has its neighboring communities that can help back it up, both from call volume or if you had to abandon that PSAP, that 911 center, they could already have pre-planned backup from your neighboring counties. You have redundancies in these IP networks that do make them more resilient, but at the same time, they also add that flexibility.
Okay, thank you. And also another question
Yes, sir.
for you. Your testimony mentions the dangers of technological obsolescence of the current 911 network, which often rely on 1970s technology. And yes, I remember the 70s. You mentioned that these dated technologies pose significant public safety risk due to higher maintenance costs, system malfunctions and outages, and increased cybersecurity vulnerability. Focusing on the cybersecurity, can you explain how next generation 911 technology is less vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks than the legacy 911 network?
Yes, sir. And in a next generation environment, it's also vulnerable, but the difference is once again the intelligence. It's either putting cybersecurity detection devices at the edge of those new IP networks, or it's also with the work Steve Souter and I did with the FCC TOFOPA work. We actually have a full report that we published in December, this past December, that speaks to cybersecurity for public safety and the risk. And we make a recommendation to introduce an added element, not only just for 911 purposes, but also for general public safety systems where they can have the added protection, detection, aversion, and also the notification feature. Oftentimes, I think, as Mr. Fogarty mentioned, our public safety agencies don't know they're even in an attack today. Those companies that do networks for 911, we have cyber elements, and we monitor and detect, but they can actually infiltrate the PSAPs themselves. And so in an IP world, we can actually strengthen that ability to hopefully divert those attacks on those systems.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Fogarty, my next question is for you. The Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act required a report on the legal and regulatory framework surrounding Next Generation 911. Do you agree with that report's recommendations?
And that's been some time ago, so I can't recall all of the
years,
recommendations yet. But I do recall that quite a few of the recommendations actually in that report followed comments that we had provided to the FCC. And we certainly support everything that we said then just as much as we did then. It's all very important. You know, we need comprehensive liability protection for not just network providers, but also originating service providers. That was something we mentioned in there. If you want folks like Apple and Google and Facebook to get in and 911 enable their services, they've got to have the same assurances, and frankly at a national level, that telecom carriers in the wireline and wireless world get at a state level. That's very important. You've also got to have as Walt mentioned earlier, you've got to have things like a National Forest Guide and an ability to credential PSAPs with a cryptographic certificate authority. There are things like that that the FCC, took our recommendations on, reported those to Congress. We agree with all of that.
Do you think the 911 Coordination Office needs to submit the cost study required by the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Creation Act in order for Congress to adequately evaluate the needs to be done to complete the transition to Next Generation 911?
That's a hard question, Congressman. I always think it's better to have a report in hand when you're going to do something. However, the clock is ticking. Every day, every week, every month that we wait to get this process started, the costs for local and state governments are going up, and the outcomes for consumers and field responders are going down. That is an untenable state of affairs, and it's one that we need to fix. So while I always want that if I can get it, I'm not willing to say we should just wait continuously.
Okay, thank you. Before I yield back, Madam Chairwoman, I have a couple of articles I'd like to submit for the record. Update to 911 issues in Dallas, and mobile not at fault for ghost 911 calls.
So ordered. Gentleman yields back. Ms. Brooks, the leader of our NG 911 efforts, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Madam Chair. And as we've heard from my colleague from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, we have been involved in as chairs of subcommittees in Homeland Security on emergency preparedness, response, and communications. So we've both been involved, as have a number of folks on this subcommittee in these issues, because it's so very critically important. And I look forward to working with each of you in the future as we continue to explore these issues, and want to thank all of you for coming in. I want to, of course, ask Mr. Ritter, and want to applaud your leadership in Indiana. And we have prioritized emergency communications in a big way in our state, whether it's from not diverting funds out of our trust fund, which I realize now is a much bigger deal than maybe I fully appreciated, having a statewide 911 board that's overseeing rapid deployment. But you also mentioned public-private partnerships, and you were the only one that mentioned public-private partnerships. And if you could please describe that as our approach in Indiana. Do you believe that we've saved money by pursuing Next Gen 911 in this deployment model, and what other advantages do you believe it brings? And then I'd be curious in hearing from other experts here what their thoughts are on the public-private partnership model. Mr. Ritter?
Yes, thank you. When I came to this job 7 years ago, I was a staff of one, and to the wisdom of the General Assembly, when they created the wireless board, they chose to pursue a version then of the public-private partnership. My colleagues around the country, there are varying models of state-run networks operated within state agencies. However, we chose in Indiana to maintain the course in this public-private partnership, in that we did not have the infrastructure built in our own state for a public safety grade network to move 911 to. We knew that that would be cost prohibitive to start a new initiative to build, and therefore we chose to leverage the economy of scale, the expertise and the technology, if you will, from the private sector to provide to us a design as to what they could build and provide to meet the needs of our citizens in the state.
How many partners would you say you have in the system?
Two primary vendors that will be providing networks are at the top of that list. However, their requirements to connect with other system service providers in the state add to that count, as well as the vendors who operate the equipment inside of the PSAPs. So as we build this network, the list of those partners continues to grow.
And have you discussed this model, and I'm curious from your other colleagues across the country, is this a model, have we saved money in part because of this, found efficiencies, and relied, I would guess, on the expertise from the private sector?
I'd like to say that, yes, we have saved money. When the General Assembly asked me how much it was going to cost to build these networks in Indiana, my answer was, I have no idea. Trust me. And it came out at the end of the day that we estimate that it'll cost us, from the state's perspective, for the networks, right in the area of $15 million. Now, this process required one of the vendors to build a network in the state to participate. Their cost to build that network is not a number that they have shared, but I am sure that it was quite extensive from a private investment for that company to build, and the state's going to reap the cost savings of that.
Would anyone else like to comment on whether or not states and other areas have contemplated this, Mr. Souter?
Thank you for that very insightful question. As I attended the FirstNet board meeting yesterday, at which they announced approval to go ahead with a contract with a private-public partnership, it really struck me as being an excellent way in which 911, the deployment of next generation 911, could be looked at as well. We are going to need a new network. In our world, we call it an ESINet, an Emergency Services Integrated Internet Network. The ESINet will not be telephone poles and wires between them, nor manholes in the street. It will be in the cloud, if you will. There is no need at all for any 911 center to build its own ESINet. There are ways in which they can avail themselves of the private sector to deploy that ESINet. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities that exist as we look to deployment as to how we do that, and I go back again in the most cost-effective way possible.
Thank you, and thank you all for your expertise.
And if I could add to that too, the state of Texas is doing the same type of thing in that we've selected vendors to work with us and partner, and that rarely is it ever going to be a state employee that's actually going to be running the switches and managing it. There will be a vendor or service provider backing us.
Thank you all. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. Mr. Souter, as you said earlier, one of the most important components of a successful response to a 911 call is knowing the location of the emergency. Responders need to know, for instance, that we're in this room if it's called, and you made that clear last time. Do you agree that quicker response times are a benefit of Next Gen 911, and can you describe how Next Gen 911 can help with location accuracy and mapping for first responders?
Thank you, and unquestionably, there are appropriate standards within the 911 world as to how quickly a 911 call is answered, and once answered, how quickly a unit that it needs to be dispatched is dispatched. In an ideal world, if the information that was provided initially through networks provided the exact location of the caller, it would save a huge amount of time. The reality is that on a typical 911 call in my former position, took about 40 seconds of a 1-minute time frame in which to get the dispatch achieved, 40 seconds to ensure that you had the right address. That doesn't leave a whole lot of time for triaging the call taker about the emergency being reported. So yes, in the next generation world, there will be a very, very large decrease in the amount of time to verify and confirm the address from which the call was coming, and consequently how quickly units can be dispatched to that call.
And you also indicate that the cost of Next Gen 911 depends on each deployment. And I read that statement to imply that some states might wind up with deployments that are better than others. Given the network architecture underlying Next Gen 911, would that undermine the deployment of Next Gen 911 nationally?
I do not believe so. I think all of us at this table have said repeatedly that 911 should be a local issue, whether local at the state, county, or local level. But it's very important that these principal fundamental guidelines that are already established through the Task Force on Optimal PSAP architecture are followed, because they're designed in a way to give options and alternatives to the way in which Next Generation 911 is deployed, allowing for the differences that exist in different communities.
Mr. Magnuson, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. The location accuracy isn't necessarily a complete 911 issue. The problem is that our location information depends heavily today upon network equipment and satellite location. And unfortunately, in-building location is a real problem. There are efforts going on right now within NIST and within the FCC and a number of organizations to try to figure out a better technological way of increasing or improving in-building location accuracy without breaking the bank, because unfortunately a lot of the solutions that are out there today would be exorbitantly expensive and would not be implemented. So while this is somewhat a policy and a funding issue, there are also some very significant technical hurdles, and quite frankly, if we could find a perfect in-building location solution that was somewhere between next to nothing and free, we would have done it, but I don't think that solution exists.
Keep searching. Mr. Fogarty, we've heard that a central authority of some type at the state level is critical to accomplishing the transition in an efficient and timely manner. Ms. Boyd suggests here in her testimony that the local government should be in control. And this dichotomy reminds me of some of the discussions around FirstNet. What are your observations regarding this? And from what I have gathered anecdotally, the single point of contact model at FirstNet seems to be working pretty efficiently.
So having known Mary for a long time, I think I would say that there's no air between us on this issue. We agree that local control is very important. State coordination is equally important. I'm a member of FirstNet's PSAC, and I can tell you that from firsthand experience that the single point of contact model has worked extraordinarily well. It has been a feature of FirstNet's design that allowed states to move forward with this process in a coordinated fashion. I think you've heard everyone sitting here today say that doing things in a shared, hosted, coordinated environment is far better for us than trying to go out and build 6,800 unique snowflake systems. That just isn't going to work. That's not the modern way. So we absolutely at NENA believe, and I don't think we'll get too much disagreement from anybody else here, that model is quite effective.
Okay, well, thank you. Madam Chair, you back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Magnuson, we've been talking about the transition to Next Gen 911. And I want to dig in a little bit more into the transition and how that occurs. I assume there isn't a flash cut. Could you explain what the transition means in terms of the legacy networks that we're now leaving and how that factors into the costs of the transition in the short and the long term?
Yes, thank you for the question. And the transition within a local entity really has got 4 major steps that we had identified in a study that we did in 2014 again. First one is really setting up the organizational structure, making sure that somebody has responsibility for seeing it from beginning to end. Second one is transitioning existing databases to NG databases because they are fundamentally different and in essence the format. And it sounds simple, but there's complications in the way we currently read names and streets and things like that. And the third one is really to go ahead and actually create the state or local ESI nets. And then the fourth one is to convert the local call centers. As you said, that's not going to be a flash cut. We're not going to suddenly wake up next Friday morning and say the state of Texas is transitioned over. During that transition period, one of the really complicating issues is the fact that we have to have these things called legacy gateways. So if a call originates in this call center and it's NG, but it needs to be transferred to this call center and it's legacy, how do I do that transition? That's where a lot of the cost complications are going to come in, but also it's almost like you're translating two different languages, and you got to make sure that you don't really screw up the translation, because that again is where you start running into problems. So.
Yeah. I'm just curious, do we have companies that are building a bridge? I'm a software engineer by trade, and so when we implement large software systems, we sometimes have to have legacy interfaces from legacy systems to the new systems during the transition period. So do we have capabilities built in now to bridge the current 9/11 systems to the next gen systems so that you can make that crossover transition?
Yes, sir. Not only do we have companies that are building them, but they're also defined into the architecture. One of them is called an LNG, a legacy network gateway. The other one's an LSRG, a legacy selective router geteway. So one's NG to legacy, the other one's legacy to NG. So both of those architectures, both of those transitions are defined, and there are several companies that are building them.
Okay, great. Ms. Boyd, your testimony mentions the dangers of technological obsolescence of the current 9/11 network, which often relies on 1970s technologies. You mentioned that these dated technologies pose significant public safety risk due to higher maintenance costs, system malfunctions, outages, and increased cybersecurity vulnerability. Focusing in on the cybersecurity aspects, can you explain how next-gen 9/11 technology is less vulnerable to cybersecurity attack than legacy 9/11 networks are?
Yes, sir. Not that IP networks aren't vulnerable. I'd like to clarify that. I think the difference is when you have an intelligent IP network, you have the ability to introduce cybersecurity elements that exist today in companies that provide 911 network services. They do a lot of good work to detect and divert. However, the public safety agencies themselves don't have those technologies. Recent work that Mr. Souter and I did with the FCC on the TFOPA report published, we have a full section on cybersecurity and the recommendations on what we do in a next generation network to ensure that our PSAPs are secure.
Okay, all right. Mr. Fogarty, military installations, the people, their families on bases throughout the United States rely on their smartphones in many cases, just like ordinary citizens do. Do you know if the transition to next-gen 9/11 capabilities is underway on military bases, and should it be?
As a matter of fact, Congressman, it is. And in fact, our organization is working very closely with the Pentagon to make sure that as they do roll out NG 911, they're not only looking at the technological aspects of it, but also the operational pieces of it. You know, for the longest time, the telecommunicators and dispatchers in the military context, the military does operate PSAPs just like civilian jurisdictions do. They have not had standards for training, call answering, and so forth. We're working with them to fix that.
Great. Madam Chair, I was a communications squadron and group commander, deputy commander in the Air Force, and I can tell you that our military folks will be very concerned about this transition and that it's done right.
I agree with you on that, and I recognize Mr. Flores for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. And Dr. Magnuson, I'm sorry I wasn't here to formally introduce you. We had an energy subcommittee hearing at exactly the same time. But that said, I do appreciate all the great work that you do at the Internet 2 Technology Center at Texas A&M, and also applaud the work you've done with Public Safety LTE and the rollout of Next-Gen 9/11. Continuing, Dr. Magnuson, one of the things you discussed in your testimony is the need for a national layer to interconnect state NG 9/11 networks. Can you explain the national backbone and what it brings to the transition?
Yes, sir. And the question, basically, I think we've addressed already. Part of it was the fact that we really need a method for the states to be able to interconnect and send transfer information from state to state. But another large benefit of having a national backbone or a national interconnection point is things like FirstNet. Are they going to really connect at every PSAP, or are they going to connect in every region, or are they going to connect at 3 or 4 places across the state? Some of our large companies, such as our large VoIP service providers, typically have got 5 or 6 major call centers across the U.S. So if we have to basically require for them to connect in every single state, which quite frankly in an IP world makes no sense.
Right.
So if we can really go ahead and have a system that can aggregate some of those connections, it'll be more effective more effective for 911, actually be more effective, cost effective for the vendors as well. And it also could serve basically as I was talking a little bit earlier about the shared services, the private cloud type concept. Because again, if I'm going to have my services out in a cloud, if that cloud is protected and that cloud is basically designed under the same types of premises that Mary was talking about, Ms. Boyd was talking about, then in essence I have a higher level of confidence in it. If it's across commodity internet, you're going to have a hard time selling that one to public safety.
Right, right. One of the things I noticed in the research prior to this hearing is that there are certain state laws and tariffs and regulations that are inhibiting, or actually I'd say inadvertently inhibiting the migration to IP-enabled 911. Do you have an example of that? And more importantly than the example, what would you recommend that Congress consider doing to try to help the states alleviate those impediments?
And again, some of my colleagues can speak to that as well. But one of them, for example, again, in the case of Illinois, was an issue where the state regulations required that 911 services be purchased under a tariff. Well, in an era where telephone companies are deregulating, tariffs are going away. So it's things like that, in essence, trying to check that block just don't work.
Right. In your testimony, you talked about the misrouting that it can occur when you're calling from close to the border on either side of the border. How will NG 911 help to alleviate this problem where the calls are misrouted to the wrong country?
The current system actually is based on a concept where for wireless calls, I route on the location of the tower. And that's initially how the call routing is performed. So the scenario is this: I'm a U.S. citizen and I'm on a cell plan with a U.S. telephone company. I cross over the border to go ahead and have lunch. Let's say I'm going into Canada. When I make that call, since if I'm right on the border, my call could actually still be home to a U.S. tower. That call actually could very easily and would, in fact, be routed to a 911 call center, let's say, for example, in upstate New York. Well, if I'm sitting in Canada, there's nothing the call center in upstate New York can really do to resolve that issue. So what they're doing right now is what they call a blind transfer, where I just dial the 10-digit number of the call center on the other side of the border, and that's the thing that Mr. Ritter was saying that we're trying to eliminate in the state crossings. Well, that's prevalent across the Mexico and Canadian systems as well. Obviously, Canada has implemented 911, and Mexico recently had another number. Mexico recently had actually adopted 911 as their national number as well. So the dialing sequence is the same, but unfortunately the networks are not interconnected.
Right, right. And lastly, in your testimony, you talked about the need for better interstate connectivity. We know, obviously, why the connectivity is needed. Now that we've got cloud technology, it makes it fairly simple. Well, I'm oversimplifying simple, but that said, I've run out of time, so I'd ask you to supplementally answer, if you can, what actions Congress should take to help facilitate that interstate connectivity. And thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Costello is batting cleanup, and you're recognized.
Thank you. A couple observations, and then Mr. Magnuson, I have a question for you. I previously served as a county commissioner and in a very populated, high-growth county in southeastern Pennsylvania, where it seemed every year we got a little bit less from the state 911 fund because more counties are getting in the game of providing their own 911 call centers rather than going to a regional approach, and that's because the state essentially enables counties to do what they'd like with it. I always felt that you should have some sort of population threshold in order to have your own 911 center, or some sort of formula, because to a point that was made earlier, there's just so much duplication that it becomes very frustrating, because in high-need counties that do need to operate their own call centers, there's less revenue in order to draw from. The other observation that I had is Pennsylvania is not one of the states that does not use their 911 money for what it should be used for. I think I saw there's 5 or 6 states. And I'm just having a little bit of difficulty. I'll just put this into the record. In a county, you have a county controller. At least in Pennsylvania, it's referred to that. I'm sure in other states it's referred by another title. It's an elected position. And you have to sign off and verify that the funds are being utilized for a lawful purpose. If it's at the state level, I presume it would be a comptroller or auditor general or something to that effect. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty how 911 funds are used for something other than 911 purposes. I think that we should all scrutinize that a little bit closer, because somewhere along the way, I think somebody's signing a check that they're not allowed to sign. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the PSAP inventory report from 2016 identified challenges to regionality. In some counties, there are frequent interstate mutual aid considerations across borders. In New York, New Jersey, where I am in South Jersey, which is part of New Jersey, but if you're from New Jersey, obviously I think there's North Jersey and South Jersey, Delaware, and also Northern Maryland. The report also noted that many of the design and deployment phases for regional projects involve a sizable time investment, which burdens the available administrative staff from each PSAP. Mr. Magnuson, I noticed your testimony also focused on collaborative interstate connectivity layers in order to alleviate 911 technology, operation, and policy issues, such as the Midwest's Interstate Playbook. One, could this be a model used for other areas of the country, specifically in the crowded Northeast Corridor, where my district is? And two, can you please further explain how this interstate layer or interstate layers ties into national level service providers?
Okay. The collaborative effort that the states have done in the playbook makes a lot of sense for what they're doing today, because in fact there is no national interconnectivity system to really be able to manage that. So what they're really doing is doing a peering relationship with bordering states. Two problems with that. Voice over IP is not based on bordering states. Voice over IP, I could very well be talking to a company that has a call center in California, even though I'm sitting in Texas. So the bordering state concept really starts to fall apart there. But more importantly, we run into a networking we call the N+1 problem. So I can probably, everybody that gets those routes needs to propagate the routes across everybody else. With 4 states, you can do that. With 5 states, it becomes more difficult. With 50 states, it becomes impossible. Because you're having to constantly update all of your information independently, and that model is just not scalable. And that's just across the United States. Keep in mind, this architecture is really designed to go globally. So while it would be next to impossible in the U.S., you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it across the entire globe. But there's also, and as far as the global efforts, excuse me, we've been involved, we've had the honor of the last 3 years of being involved with the CAUSE experiment. CAUSE stands for U.S.-Canada Resilience Experiment, and it involves DHS S&T and the Canadian DRDC. So it involves Homeland Security of both countries. And what we do there is actually an experiment where we build networks and then we look at cross-border issues. CAUSE 5 is scheduled for November of this year, and it will have a significant NG911 component to it, because again, we need to better understand how U.S. and Canada are going to be able to work together in an NG911 environment.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yells back. That concludes our hearing, as we have no further members who want to ask questions of our witnesses. And Mr. Doyle and I were just sitting here having a conversation based on the comments that you have made for us today. You've been excellent We look forward to working with you as we continue to move forward and look at how we achieve those economies of scale, how we utilize the ability to build on work that has been done so that we deploy a little bit faster. And I want to thank you all for being with us today. I would remind members you have 10 days to submit additional questions for the panel, and I have no doubt there will be some. And I would ask that each of you please respond in writing within 10 days of receipt of those questions. And there being no further business to come before the committee today, we stand adjourned.